Did I watch The Ceremony simply because it had the same name as last week's movie? Yes, I did. But there are a lot of green flags with this one. There's a lot of green flags with the personnel, for instance. We have Claude Chabrol directing. He's one of the most influential new wave directors. Of course, his name isn't Truffaut or Godard, so who cares? I've seen Chabrol's first movie, Le Beau Serge. Some people would say that that was the first new wave film, but let's keep that can of worms closed for now. I don't remember anything about that movie. To be honest, that was way back in 1958. That's when it came out. I mean, not when I saw it. After his early hits, Chabrol seems to have spent a few decades making absolute clunkers. Let me know if you've seen any of these movies and if I should check them out, but they don't seem very promising, do they? The 90s were maybe a little resurgence for him, and a pretty good time for French cinema in general. Maybe we'll talk about that more shortly. Isabelle Huppert is in the movie, along with Jacqueline Bisset, who is British, not French, and Sandrine Bonnaire. Jean-Pierre Cassel is also in the movie, and that's a good cast, and there's good acting in this film. Like I said, some green flags with the people involved. But I went into the movie having no idea what it was about. Didn't know even what kind of movie it was, and you might be a little bit surprised what kind of movie this is. Believe me, I could ramble for hours about how to set yourself up for success when watching movies. Sometimes it's great to know nothing. Sometimes maybe you want a little bit more information. It's an art. What can I say? But hey, in this case, I'll just say that The Ceremony is an interesting hybrid. For the most part, it is a sensitive, understated personal drama, a touching story of women on the verges of society. It's also got some suspenseful music in it, though, and you really get the feeling that something might happen. I'm not going to spoil things for you, but I will tell you that something does happen. Interesting hybrid. The Ceremony follows a housekeeper, a maid, who is hired by an upper middle class family. They got a pretty nice house. Sandrine Bonnaire is the maid, not to be confused with Kate Winslet. Interestingly, this character reminds me a bit of Huppert's role in The Piano Teacher. She's very tense for most of the movie, constricted by something, constrained. She also kind of looks a little bit like Erica Cahoot, I think that's the name. But don't get it twisted, because Huppert plays someone totally different, an almost catastrophically carefree postal clerk named Jean in the nearby village. The family that Sophie's working for, Sophie, that's the maid, Sandrine Bonnaire, has an interesting role in the movie. They're kind of central characters. They're kind of in the middle of everything, but we get a slightly oblique picture of them. They go on vacation, and we don't get to go with them. They go to work, and thankfully we don't have to go with them. The movie is through Sophie's eyes. It's through Sophie's domestic lens. It's through her glasses. The drama in this movie, it stirs very naturally from real life. We start out with Jacqueline Bisset, the matriarch of the family. She plays mom, I forget her name, interviewing Sophie for this position there at some restaurant. And look, there's some natural drama here. We're going to invite this new person into our house. We learn that they've been looking for a long time, trying to find a good housekeeper. The last one wasn't that great. Well, is this going to work out? And this interview scene is really perfectly poised. It endears us a little bit to both of these characters, to this woman looking for a housekeeper and to the housekeeper looking for a job. But it also somehow subtly undermines our confidence in both of them. It kind of gives you the idea that maybe this isn't going to work, or something doesn't quite seem right. There's a real precarity in it from the very beginning. Delicately balanced movie, and you can tell a very carefully crafted movie from the opening scene. In a strange way, this movie reminds me of one of my all-time favorite films, The Nun Story. I'll try not to go on a 2-hour-long tangent about it. In this movie, Audrey Hepburn becomes a nun, and the audience is hyper-conscious of all the rules she's supposed to be following, the holy rule. You cringe each time that it seems like she might break from the holy rule. As things go on, maybe you end up questioning the rule itself. Maybe you start rooting for her to do it. But yeah, the social role creates so much of the drama, and it's a similar thing here. The drama of adhering to your role, the precarity of a social role. You want Sophie's introduction to this household to be harmonious. You get the feeling, is this movie going to be like, is this like a nails on chalkboard kind of movie to watch? And somewhat, yes. She seems, in some way that's a little hard to put your finger on, pretty vulnerable, and this endears you to her quickly. It would be painful for everyone if things didn't work out, wouldn't it? You want her to do a good job? But there's all kinds of pitfalls in this house. An interesting detail is that this old house the family lives in, it has some low ceilings in one of the hallways, and there's a few beams that hang down even lower. These beams they're painted red as a warning, and it's a great touch of realism in what is almost certainly a real house, but also perhaps a little symbol of all the domestic pitfalls that Sophie has to navigate around, all the pitfalls you could bonk your head on in this domestic life. We'll talk about domestic life more, probably. Big theme of the movie, one of the biggest. Another big theme is class. Maybe that's not too surprising in a movie about a maid. I've seen a few different takes on this movie. Some people think it's way too harsh on its working class characters. Chabrol was a communist, so it would be a little surprising if he made an anti-working class movie, but you never know. You can kind of see where these people are coming from, to be honest. On the other hand, some people might think that the family is totally heartless, stuck up. Some people might say, well, everyone sucks. This is one of those movies where there's no likable characters whatsoever. Personally, I don't think any of this is quite right. I think this is not a moralistic movie, I guess. Chabrol probably isn't making broad accusations about the rich or the poor so much as he's telling a story about some people. It's a story that evokes things about class, and not totally obvious things, though. Interestingly, the characters in this movie spend a lot of time talking about each other. Really, this is probably the main topic of conversation. The family talks about Sophie quite a bit. They have some very plausible upper middle class discussion. What do we do about this housekeeper? Partly they recoil from the idea of employing somebody. They're uneasy about having somebody working for them. They don't know what to call her. We call her a maid, a domestic, a housekeeper. They seem a little uncomfortable. They don't want to be patronizing, but they also say, well, hopefully she's better than the last one, right? So they are a little bit picky in some ways, and the family, they really are quite thoughtful and generous at times, but they also do have expectations, silent or otherwise. It's a complicated relationship. It's a strange way to relate to another person, to pay them to be in your house and iron your shirts. Sophie and the mail clerk, on the other hand, that's sort of more the working class characters. They spend plenty of time talking about the family, gossiping, you might say, speculating about what they're up to. The mail clerk has a lot of rumors. It's hard to know if they're true. I think it's a finely balanced movie. It's not obvious exactly who the audience is supposed to root for, but it's a movie, not a sporting event. Even if we don't have much didacticism, class, it's still at the center of the movie. Probably you don't want to take any of the things that the characters say as Chabrol's message here. Don't take it at face value exactly. But all this stuff emanates from some sort of imbalance. There's a weird relationship at the center of the movie between the maid and the family, employer and employee, living together in the same house. Can you imagine? And despite people's best intentions, that's unstable, right? There's some inescapable class conflict here. Or is there? An interesting thing about the ceremony is that it's very naturalistic and understated, but it's also kind of implausible. I'm not going to spoil anything here, but man, when the alien spaceship comes down, I just couldn't believe that at all. Anyway, like I said, this movie, it's a little bit of a hybrid. I'm trying to take a subtle approach in describing it because this is a subtle movie, partly, but it's also pretty exaggerated at times. And I guess I actually don't really blame people who draw kind of extreme conclusions from it. And honestly, I have sort of mixed feelings about how the movie is put together a little bit. Maybe the exaggerations are kind of enunciating what these class dynamics are like, but it does chafe at the naturalism of the film in some ways. You take a lot of very small, very natural, very believable steps, but you somehow end up with a pretty implausible movie. I don't know. Another interesting contradiction in The Ceremony is that while it's mostly a very intimate film, giving us a close-up of people's minds and emotions, it's also pretty aloof and austere. It's a little cold. Maybe this has something to do with Sophie's personality, but it's baked into the structure of the movie, really. Like I said, our relationship with the family is oblique. We don't really get to know them. You kind of know what's going on in their life, but it's not the priority, right? There's a lot of scenes that are not in the movie, a lot of stuff that's not in the movie, a lot of stuff we don't see. There's a few slightly odd chronological jumps. For instance, on Sophie's first day at the house, she gets a tour of the house and some instructions, and you might expect to see her first encounters with the family members. This is the big introductions or whatever But we actually jump right over that to dinner. Not a big deal, but it reads a little rough. Maybe that's on purpose. I don't know. This tour, by the way, is a moment of domestic pride. It's not quite the same as a tour you'd give to a guest because Jacqueline Bisset is describing how to clean all the various surfaces, demonstrating maybe in some ways her own domestic savvy, even as she's distancing herself from these menial tasks by telling another person how to do them. Later on, Sophie is going to give the mail clerk a tour of the house to, I hate to say this absolutely cliched piece of nonsense, but it's almost like another character. I don't know, but clearly the house and the domestic life and the domestic world, big part of the movie. Anyway, for the most part, very detailed movie, very carefully assembled with some really clever stuff in it too, but it also has a few odd moments. There's a strange crossfade at one point when a character takes too long to drink her tea, and then we sort of have a jump cut to when she's finished with it, and maybe this is a Godard-esque new wave thing. I don't think so. I think it's what you'd call a mistake, I guess. For some reason, Jacqueline Bisset's character leaves her car's tailgate open for a long period of time. I thought they'd better come back and close that, and they do. But why did she leave it open? I don't know. Maybe this is a French thing. Of course, one hallmark of French movies from the 1990s is that all the cars look like toys. Even the fancy ones are pretty rinky-dink. Anyway, we're getting a little bit off topic here, but surprisingly cold movie. You definitely empathize with Sophie. You get the sense that there's vulnerability there. But you also spend a lot of time wondering what exactly is going on, wondering if she's a little bit simple-minded or if it's the opposite, if there's some kind of devious master plan forming in her mind. Another quirk of this role as a maid is that most people might not completely respect maids. I'm talking about the viewers. You and I might not completely respect maids. There's a sense that it's not a great job. I think that's fair to say. But Sophie takes pride in her work. She seems to. And you can respect that, right? Until, at least, you wonder, wait, does she know about the world out there? Why are her horizons so sort of low or something? I guess we're generally pretty used to like virtuous characters, especially in Hollywood, at least. We think that, these characters, they're going to overcome their circumstances. They're going to be heroic. Isn't that the whole point of, a story, right? Sophie doesn't entirely seem interested in that or able to do it. Maybe she's afraid of something. Another little theme in the movie is television. I don't think Chabrol has quite as much to say as he maybe thinks he does here. I don't know. Television's featured conspicuously in the movie, in the domestic life. They talk about the telethon at one point. Sophie arrives, actually, right after a new TV has been set up. She arrives at the same time the television does. Later, the family is going to watch Don Giovanni on that television. Watching opera on a television, can you believe that? Sophie gets the old TV in her room, and it's in some ways quite luxurious for her. She really takes to watching it. Television seems to be kind of a dirty thing for Chabrol. I think that's what you would assume, at least. And it's interesting that Sophie watches it. Sometimes she uses it explicitly as a way to avoid her responsibility. That doesn't exactly seem very virtuous. So, do we respect this character? Interesting question. It's pretty balanced. I think that Sophie is a strong character, nonetheless. I'm not saying that this is a weak point of the movie, exactly. Definitely a nuanced character, but we are shut out a little bit. A lot of this movie is sort of wondering, I suppose, even as some other parts of it are sketched out. I don't know. Of course, look, there is one part that isn't cold at all, and that's the relationship between Sophie and the mail clerk. I say the mail clerk because I'm always so uncertain about pronouncing Jean, the woman's name. Anyway, I think it's approximately that. Anyway, for me, this relationship might be the highlight of the movie. Maybe it feels a little bit implausible that Sophie, who has been so constricted, so shy, I guess, would strike up a relationship with such a free spirit. But friendship can be implausible sometimes, right? And perhaps it's exactly this difference that attracts these people, right? Sophie, it wouldn't be hard to imagine her being subconsciously or otherwise drawn to this sense of freedom. And they have a certain type of solidarity, partly maybe stemming from class, gender, maybe something else. Even if this relationship has some costs, you can see, and even if the mail clerk sometimes seems like almost a little bit of a loose cannon, you can see the connection. I think it's pretty cool. In meeting the mail clerk, I guess Sophie, she kind of becomes a person of her own. She starts leaving the house, going out, doing things, talking to people, which, yeah, she wasn't really doing previously. I think this is most of what I have to say about the ceremony, but I'll end with a question that I asked last week too, which is, what is the ceremony? I mean, where does the name come from? This was an adaptation of a book called A Judgment in Stone. What's the stone? I'm not sure. Maybe the book is a little different. Maybe it's spelled out a little bit more. It's hard to pinpoint a particular ceremony in this movie. There's a couple literal ones, a birthday party. Perhaps we're referring more generally to a social concept, the idea of ceremony. Maybe that has something to do with this strange, unstable position that the family and the help are in. I'd be curious to know what you think if you've seen the movie. Overall, I think The Ceremony, it's an interesting movie, honestly. It's a little hard to reach a conclusion on because I think it has some real virtues. I think it has great naturalistic moments. Like I said, from the open, you can tell, oh yeah, this is a real movie. This is very delicately made. It reminds me of some of these other nice movies of the 90s, like A Heart in Winter comes to mind. I think A Heart in Winter is better than this movie, but that's a movie that is in some ways very simple, kind of a not like a new wave kind of thing, not a hugely ambitious movie in some ways, but just a deeply poignant, naturalistic, beautiful, and moving film, right? And I think you can see that some of that stuff here. It has great characters, has great actors, great, perfectly rendered. Now, I said I found it a little bit too cold and a little bit implausible. I gotta say that overall, I don't know, it didn't quite, I feel like for me at least, it didn't quite come together despite having some virtues. I definitely prefer last week's Ceremony, and I'm looking forward to next week watching a movie called something else entirely.